by our moral duty towards past. Today, we see that it is not merely about the past. Rather, our joint efforts are aimed at present and future of humanity free of hatred, racism, xenophobia and intolerance leading to mass atrocity crimes. Despite all setbacks of international human rights and security system, we will continue to actively engage in Human Rights Council and other multilateral platforms for further elaboration of tools and mechanisms for preventing genocides and other mass atrocities. I thank again the OHCHR and High Commissioner Volker Turk for organization of the meeting and wish every success to panelists and participants. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I wish to warmly welcome Ms. Alice Vairimun-Deritu, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide, who is here with us to deliver her opening statement. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address the Human Rights Council at this intersessional meeting to mark the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, with a particular focus on the role of new technologies, social media in particular, in the spread of hate speech and incitement to violence that could lead to genocide and related atrocity crimes. This meeting is exceedingly timely as we're just a few days away from the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention and the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide and of the Prevention of this crime that we will mark on 8th December through a high-level event at UN headquarters in New York. This will be the culmination of several months of dialogue and engagement that my office has undertaken throughout the year to mark this important occasion. The theme for this year's commemoration is A Living Force in World Society, the legacy of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. A living force is what Raphael Lemkin, the Polish lawyer who created the name genocide, had hoped and voiced that the convention could become. The Genocide Convention was the first human rights treaty adopted by the General Assembly only 3 years after its creation on 9th December 1948. One day before the adoption, this happened one day before the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the 10th of December 1948, which the UN is also commemorating this year. I would like to begin by extending my deepest gratitude to Armenia for their role in the adoption of the GA resolution establishing the International Day commemorating the Day of Victims of Genocide, and also for the regular resolutions to the Human Rights Council supporting the prevention of genocide. I would also like to appreciate all member states for the consensus on these resolutions. The Genocide Convention codified in international law the crime of genocide and created a dual obligation to prevent and punish this heinous crime. The Convention in its 75 years has provided the framework and impetus for several international, regional and national actions, in particular on accountability for the crime of genocide. The crime of genocide as defined in the Convention was utilized in the statutes of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and also the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it allowed for the prosecution of the genocides that happened against the Tutsi in Rwanda and in Srebrenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina. This same definition is now part of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The Convention has also provided the framework for several national and hybrid tribunals, including the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia and several others. Equally important, through its ratification and domestication, the Convention has enabled the crime of genocide to be criminalized in several national jurisdictions across the world. Regarding the prevention obligation, the Convention has provided the framework for advocacy on and for the establishment of numerous national and regional initiatives for prevention. For example, we have seen such initiatives in the National Committees on Genocide Prevention established in the Great Lakes region of Africa. These are just a few examples, but there are many more. As part of the focus of this year's commemoration, my office has held several consultation processes to assess and articulate the legacy of the Convention. We've organized expert meetings focusing on the prevention, accountability, and memorialization of the Convention. We've also requested member states to provide written input on upholding the Convention's legacy, highlighting national examples. All this will be presented at the event on 8th December in New York. As of today, 153 member states have ratified the Genocide Convention, the latest of which was Zambia in June 2022. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my call to all states to ratify the convention. I also urge all states to ensure that domestic legislation prohibits genocide and to put in place mechanisms at the national level for prevention in line with the convention. The goal of the drafters of the convention was to drive in ensuring that the horrors of the Holocaust and of the Second World War would never happen again. We do know that we have not been successful in living up to this commitment. Honoring the legacy of the convention and, most importantly, the victims of genocides across the world requires all of us to make the convention universal both in its ratification and in its implementation. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the specific focus of today's meeting on the role of social media platforms and their instrumentalization by those seeking to spread hate, leading to real-world discrimination and violence, is especially relevant for genocide prevention today. Hate speech, discrimination, and the dehumanization of the other is not new. They preceded the Holocaust, they preceded the genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsi, they preceded the genocide in Srebrenica, and several other situations where serious human rights violations, which may amount to genocide or related atrocity crimes, have occurred. However, new technologies and social media have allowed hate speech to spread and be amplified at rates never seen before, and also exacerbated existing concerns for communities at risk of genocide and related atrocity crimes. It could also be a trigger of such crimes. Some of the mechanisms set up by this Council, including the fact-finding mission for Myanmar, have documented how online hate speech on social media has impacted gross human rights violations committed in this country. The Secretary General made tackling hate speech a key priority across the UN system through the launch in 2019 of the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, for which my office is the United Nations system-wide global focal point. In his report to the Human Rights Council on the Prevention of Genocide, published in July this year, the Secretary General also specifically highlighted the importance of countering and addressing hate speech as part of genocide prevention efforts. My office has worked closely across the UN system with member states and tech and social media companies to counter and address the root causes and impacts of hate speech in line with the UN strategy. For example, since 2020, my office has organized annual roundtable dialogues bringing together tech and social companies, the UN system, civil society, and relevant special procedure mandate holders to discuss the challenges and opportunities in tackling online hate speech and identifying partnerships in this regard. The recommendations from these dialogues were published earlier this year in a policy paper called Countering and Addressing Online Hate Speech, a Guide for Policymakers and Practitioners. The paper sets out concrete recommendations for tech and social media companies, member states, the United Nations, and civil society. It highlights the importance of transparency and accountability, of using a human rights-based approach to tackling hate speech online, of developing contextual responses that are inclusive, especially of those targeted by hate, as well as of implementing measures that are commensurate to its impact. Finally, it also emphasizes the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships in addressing these challenges, understanding and addressing not only the impact and spread of hate online, but also its root causes, drivers, and offline and online effects in our societies. So let me conclude by reiterating that this is particularly important time for this discussion. The number of situations across the world where communities are at risk of genocide and related atrocity crimes remains of concern, many of which I highlighted in my interactive dialogue with this Council last July. The situations across the world in which hate speech and incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence are being spread and instrumentalized continue to alarm. I welcome the engagement of the Human Rights Council on this topic and look forward to a continued dialogue on it to achieve our common goal of a world free from genocide and related atrocity crimes. Thank you.
I thank you. Colleagues, the list of speakers is now closed, and we will now begin the panel discussion on the use of social media platforms to amplify hate speech that could lead to genocide, defining the problem. Let me welcome our distinguished panelists, Ms. Peggy Hicks, Director of the Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development Division of the OHCHR, Mr. Meddat Pandech, Member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and Ms. Simona Cruciani from the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Now let me give the floor to Ms. Peggy Hicks. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. It's a pleasure to be here with the Special Advisor and yourself and our distinguished panel to talk about these important issues. Some 10 years ago, social media was applauded as a tool that could revolutionize advocacy, shining light on human rights abuses in the darkest corners and uniting people across the globe. Today, political leaders, commentators, even Nobel Prize winners are excoriating leading platforms for undermining democracy, spreading disinformation, and feeding hate. Rarely has a technological development gone from being heralded to hated in so short a time. Low levels of trust and new heights in polarization are documented and social media denounced as responsible for our woes. In this panel, our task is to define the problem relating to the platform's role in spreading hate speech that could lead to genocide. But understanding this problem requires casting our net more broadly beyond villainous tech companies to rethink the responsibilities of governments, companies, and users, and understand better how to and how not to address online hate speech. Starting with the problem. There can be no dispute, and we have already heard on this front, that today's social media is a hotbed of hateful content. I'd recommend to all of you a report by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union last week that did an in-depth survey on 4 platforms in 4 countries with the usual shocking results about the prevalence of hate speech, particularly misogyny and racial discrimination-related speech. Unfortunately, what we see online reflects what is being said and done offline as well. Traditional media spreads conspiracy theories and hate as well, and we see a rise in hate crimes of all varieties. If social media just reflects the world around us, why so much focus on the platforms? The attention is well-deserved and can be summarized in 2 words: reach and speed. When we talk about reach, we're talking about the fact that social media allows even local content to have global impact. Social media platforms are a key distribution tool for traditional media content as well. And on speed, we recognize that the metabolism of social media content creates new, extremely difficult challenges. Thousands of clicks can occur in minutes, and within each, the possibility for redistribution and spread. So it's essential for us to address online hate speech. But how do we go about doing it? In talking about the solutions, we need to start by recognizing that there are no simple answers, and there also is not just one responsible party here. Looking at the answers piece. We have in place some very important tools to address hate speech online. The Rabat Plan of Action and its 6-part test is in use by governments and companies across the globe in helping us to look at when incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, what we're referring to as hate speech, is occurring. Yet we all know that hate speech is contextual, coded, and difficult to moderate online. I've seen examples where seasoned lawyers have been presented with the challenges that content moderators face on a day-to-day basis, and they've all come up with different answers to a series of questions on content moderation issues around hate speech. It requires time, contextual understanding, and language skills to make the right decisions in moderating content on relating to hate speech. Some of these questions as well do not have easy answers, and we have to recognize that. An example of this that I've seen talked a lot about are statements in the form of death to so-and-so. Now, we'd usually think of anybody calling for death to someone as the type of thing that definitely needs to be taken offline. But in some contextual contexts, that phrase is used in a way that is pejorative. It's descriptive rather than actual. And then you run into a question of whether or not it falls within the category of restricted speech or not. That's just an example of some of the challenges that we face. And one thing we need to recognize is that as hard as these challenges are for humans to address, automated systems are even worse at addressing these issues in an effective way. The second thing we need to recognize, though, in talking about the challenges of addressing hate speech online is that we cannot allow ourselves to be drawn into false trade-offs, as some would do, arguing that we cannot both protect freedom of expression and effectively address hate speech. What we know is, in fact, that emphasizing both of those values, both the need to address incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, and the need to protect freedom of expression, is the most effective way for us to create a trusted and safe environment online. One key element of this is my third point, which is that we have to move beyond a binary approach that focuses simply on taking up or leaving down content as the issue. We know that, in fact, focusing on takedown of content is a way that is a path that can actually exacerbate the problem. Evidence shows that more restrictions and suppression tend to increase mistrust in institutions and increase the scope for abuse and polarization. That's why we need to explore and use the broad range of other options to deal with difficult content, including, for example, adding fact-check labels, downranking, de-amplifying, placing content under warning labels, removing some harmful content, disabling advertising revenue, and deactivating accounts. Yet at the same time that we look at these difficult approaches and need for a broad range of solutions, we need to recognize as well, as I said, that not just one party is responsible for the online hate speech that we see and for addressing it. We need to look not only at companies, but also at governments and users. Starting first, though, with companies, what do we expect from them? The first point I need to make here is that we have to differentiate between companies. They are not all the same, as much as we would like to group them together under the label of social media platforms. There are huge differences, for example, between moderating video content and speech content directly. Platforms like YouTube often escape some of the scrutiny that we see for other platforms like Twitter or Facebook because it is that much more difficult to moderate video content. It's also the case that within that spectrum, there are companies that have online transparency reports and have published their content moderation companies, and there are companies that have said explicitly that they do not want to moderate content and will not do so in accordance with international standards. So we can't treat all social media companies as if they're addressing these problems in the same way. Within that spectrum, our goal is to incentivize those who are taking measures to address hate speech and to make them want to do more, not less. That means that we need to make sure that whenever we are highlighting those who are publishing the transparency reports, which of course show flaws, that we're also at the same time recognizing the steps that they are taking to improve these practices while recognizing the companies that I said that are doing nothing at all or in fact even pushing back on the need for some of this content moderation. The second point regarding the companies is the need to emphasize greater transparency on the platforms. This applies to multiple layers. They need, as I said, to be transparent about what they are doing about online content. That means transparent policies as to how they intend to address hate speech. Some of them have, as I said, explicitly brought in the Rabat six-part test. We've seen work done on this, for example, by both Meta and TikTok. At the same time, The data that we need from the companies is simply not available to be able to understand and address the problems of hate speech online in the way that we'd like to. We need API access for researchers to be able to figure out what is happening on the platforms and how best to address it. And in fact, we've seen a move in the opposite direction since Twitter moved to become X. They had originally been very helpful in this area and have now moved back, and other companies are following suit. We need that data to be able to address this problem better, and it's something that can be regulated. At the same time, the transparency reports that I've mentioned are helpful, but they're not enough. We need real-time information on current challenges and responses. Issues don't wait until a company could go back in and send us a report, 6, 10, 12 months after the abuses have occurred. We need to understand and get access to that data in real time. Third, and most importantly, I think, we need to stress that the companies need to do better in specifically addressing contextual and language-specific responses. We know that there is an immense disparity of resources donated by the companies to English language environments, for example, versus other environments, something that was well documented with regards to Meta, for example, but it's true across the platforms in general. We need again, to incentivize greater spending, greater investment, so that they have the resources available to do better. An example of this was, again, Meta, one of the companies that has actually addressed some of these issues. For example, when they were confronted by some of the concerns about their approach to the Israel-Palestine issues that arose in 2021, they commissioned a review by Business Social Responsibility on how they had done. And one of the findings of that review is a very important one, and I think it's important to look at it both in the context of what happened then, what's happening now, but also remember it's the company that actually commissioned somebody to look at this issue. We need to think about all the companies who haven't even taken that step. But one of the things it found, for example, is that the way it was treating Hebrew and Arabic language content was different for a variety of reasons, and there was a need to go further and address those issues to bring a uniform approach to its content moderation across those different languages. The actions that the companies take need to be proportional to the severity of the risk. That goes to the issues I raised earlier about the different ways in modifying content. And they need to facilitate access to local communities and individuals to their platforms and to their complaint mechanisms. But turning quickly to the role of states and what we expect from them. We know that it's states' responsibility to put in place effective guardrails for company actions, including by requiring them to take the types of steps I've outlined in terms of transparency and accountability. This is explicit within the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. We also often think of that as something that addresses only the companies, but remember that the first pillar is about state responsibilities and obligations in this regard. But we know that the dangers of states overstepping the mark here are painfully clear, as countless people currently detained for online posts can attest. State regulation, if done precipitously, sloppily, or with ill intent, can easily consolidate undemocratic and discriminatory approaches that limit free speech, suppress dissent, and undermine a variety of other rights. So with that in mind, we're calling on states to ensure wide access to information and maintain a pluralistic and vibrant civic space, ensuring journalists, human rights defenders, academics, and all other stakeholders can safely contribute to debate, including by debunking unverifiable and inaccurate information. But they need also at the same time to meet their state obligations regarding media and social media providers by requiring greater transparency and accountability of the platforms. Finally, they need to make sure that they're not looking solely at social media and that the roles that they take there apply to the mainstream media as well. And finally, as I said, it's not just one actor, it's not just the companies, it's not just governments, but it's also all of us, the public. We need for the public to engage in these issues ourselves, to increase efforts to strengthen digital and media literacy as a means for individuals to better navigate a complex information system. Within the public, we need greater responsibility from public figures and influencers who have a critical role to play and need to refrain from amplifying and disseminating hateful content online. Those are some of the key steps that we're looking to hear more about in today's discussions and to see implemented across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Mr. Meddat Pandey. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the opportunity to address the issue of the use of social media platforms to amplify hate speech that could lead to genocide. This is a topic that touches upon the core mandate of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination recognizes the interlinkage between racist hate speech and incitement to racial hatred and violence that can lead to mass atrocities and genocide. And the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in exercising its mandate, puts a strong focus on mechanisms to prevent and to react to racist hate speech, to the dissemination of racist hate speech in the media, on the internet and through social media. Since the focus of this first panel is to define the problem, allow me to make 3 general observations regarding the specific potential of social media use and misuse to amplify hate speech. First, regarding the issue in general, the Human Rights Council, in Resolution 49/9 on prevention of genocide, expressed its concern, and I quote, that misuse of new technologies, in particular social media platforms, can amplify hate speech and can contribute to national, ethnic, racial or religious polarization. This concern is shared by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In the practice of the committee, concerns regarding incidents of hate speech have shifted from focusing on the media in general to hate speech spread over the internet and through social media. Such concerns are expressed in the committee's general recommendation number 35 on combating racist hate speech. Within dialogues with states, the committee regularly inquires whether and how states regulate hate speech on social media, in particular when it constitutes incitement to violence or can contribute to an environment susceptible to violence. In its general recommendation number 36 on racial profiling, the committee furthermore emphasizes the potential of algorithms to perpetuate existing racial bias and to reinforce structures of inequality and discrimination. And the committee has also addressed the rise of racist hate speech on social media in specific cases under its early warning and urgent action procedure. Secondly, I want to turn to the specific characteristics regarding the dissemination of hate speech through social media, and Mrs. Hicks has already mentioned social media's reach and speed. The report of the Secretary General, prepared for the 53rd session of the Human Rights Council, titled Impact of Technological Advances on Prevention of Genocide Efforts and on the Risks of the Perpetration of Genocide, outlines the potential dangers of social media. It highlights in particular the use of social media platforms as echo chambers for hate speech and incitement, as well as the amplifying role of algorithms in this regard, which can incentivize divisive, misleading, hateful and violent content. These characteristics of social media lead to a potential diffusion of responsibility which becomes apparent when compared to traditional media. The spread of hate speech over traditional media raises the question of the responsibility of the person uttering the speech act, the media company broadcasting it, and the state authority failing to regulate or to react properly. With social media, the question of responsibility becomes more complicated. Hate speech is oftentimes disseminated by anonymous or fake accounts. The negative impact of the spread of hate speech over social media follows from the interplay of a variety of actors and multipliers. The persons or institutions behind hate speech campaigns can be hard to identify, and again, Mrs. Hicks has also mentioned this challenge. And while artificial intelligence algorithms play an important role in personalizing and amplifying information, the focus on algorithms should not lead to the misconception that the regulation of hate speech on social media is primarily a technological challenge. It is the decision and therefore the responsibility of individuals and of institutions to utter hate speech, to further disseminate it, and to allow for algorithms to amplify the negative consequences of hate speech. These characteristics of social media need to be reflected in the obligations to prevent genocide, which will be addressed in the second panel today. Thirdly, both the Human Rights Council as well as the Secretary General also highlight the positive sides of social media. According to the Secretary General, digital technologies are meant to offer new ways for people to exercise their rights and freedoms. The Human Rights Council held, and I quote, that the presence of an organized, knowledgeable, strong and representative civil society and of free, diverse and independent media able to operate freely would significantly reduce the risk of genocide. I would like to highlight two words in the statement of the Human Rights Council: the requirement of a representative civil society, as well as the positive impact of a diverse media. Building on the practice and experience of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a significant challenge becomes apparent. Marginalized racial or ethnic minorities oftentimes are not adequately represented in the media and face challenges in presenting their perspectives and experiences. And while social media might provide a space for marginalized communities to make their voices heard, the general mechanisms of exclusion and marginalization that are at work in cases of structural discrimination and of institutional racism also apply in the digitalized world and to social media. Artificial intelligence algorithms may even amplify patterns of exclusion and of marginalization. Strengthening the civic space of marginalized communities in the real world, enhancing their representation in the media, and guaranteeing their equal access to social and political contexts can therefore also contribute to their ability to effectively counter negative stereotypes and misleading narratives on social media. I thank you very much.
Thank you. And now let me invite Simona Cruciani. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I will start my remarks by reiterating a point that has been already made by the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, that is the direct connection between hate speech and genocide. So there is really causality between hate speech and the perpetration of the crimes. We have seen this in many situations. We have seen this in the Holocaust. We have seen it in Bosnia, Rwanda. It has already been mentioned, but I wanted to reinforce this point because it's also highlighted in the main policy document that our office uses for the monitoring and analysis of situations at risk of genocide and related atrocity crimes, that is called the Framework for Analysis. Of course, not all hate speech is the same. We know very well that there are 3 levels of hate speech. We have heard very well from my distinguished colleague from the Office of the High Commissioner, who highlighted incitement to discrimination or hostility or violence, that is prohibited speech. We also have hate speech that might be limited according to Article 19 of the ICCPR. And then we have many more instances of hate speech, I would say the majority, that invade social media companies and the online space that many times are protected by freedom of opinion and expression. The Special Advisor in her remarks mentioned the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech. That is the main UN document that inspired the work of the United Nations to tackle the last form of hate speech that I mentioned, this huge quantity of hate speech that at times might be protected speech, but despite that might still be very dangerous because it might escalate into more dangerous forms of hate speech and even prohibited speech, and can lead to violence offline, but also genocide and atrocity crimes. Now, the strategy of the Secretary General gives a definition to these forms of hate speech, that is a working level definition, is not a legal one. And I just wanted to remind us all of how we define hate speech in the United Nations. We define it as any kind of communication in speech, writing or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other forms of identity. This is often rooted in and generates intolerance and hatred, and in certain contexts can be demeaning and divisive. So, as I say, this is the main focus of the strategy of the Secretary General and the main focus of the work of my office in tackling these forms of hate speech in collaboration with the rest of the United Nations system and through the work of the UN Working Group on hate speech that we chair. Today, I would like to focus on a specific form of hate speech that is genocide denial. Genocide denial, at our office, we consider it as an indicator of the risk of future genocides. And in this context, I would like to mention a policy paper that my office issued at the beginning of 2023 that is called Combating Holocaust and Genocide Denial, Protecting Survivors, Preserving Memory, and Promoting Prevention. So it's available online, it's public, and we encourage you to consult it. Genocide denial is often tied to hate speech, specifically when the aim is to target individuals or groups based on specific identity factors. When it reaches the threshold of incitement speech, it's prohibited under international law. And here I would like to quote the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, who said that genocide denial turns perpetrators and war criminals into heroes and heroines. It sows fear, mistrust, and hate. It divides people, communities, and states. It does not allow for healing and empathy. It also undermines the judicial decisions that have been made and therefore undermines justice. This is to the contrary of what societies which have experienced conflict and have a legacy of atrocity crimes require. It is unacceptable and must be condemned. Now, when we go back to the policy paper that I just mentioned, it has a lot of recommendations to different stakeholders on how to tackle genocide denial. But because we are focusing today on online hate speech, I would like to focus specific recommendations that the paper gives, in particular to tackle online hate speech and in particular to tackle social media companies. So the paper calls for increased investment in education, calling UN actors, civil society, social media companies, and online platforms to develop proactive strategies to advance education about genocide and related atrocity crimes and about the dangers of denial and distortion online. A particular focus should be directed to identifying effective strategies for influencing youth through online campaigns. Second, it calls for stopping amplifications. UN actors should remind social media companies of their responsibility to refrain from amplifying genocide denial and distortion that can incite hatred against communities that have experienced genocide and other atrocity crimes. It also calls, number 3, for adoption of the UN definition on hate speech. Social media companies and online platforms should be encouraged to adopt the definitions of hate speech and of the United Nations and adapt community standards to more comprehensively recognize that denial and distortion of genocide and related atrocity crimes can cause re-victimization, repeat historical patterns of discrimination and negative stereotypes, and incite hostility and violence. It calls for implement mitigation measures. It says that social media companies should be encouraged to take affirmative efforts to mitigate the impact of genocide denial and distortion through varying forms of content moderation, including but not limited to content removal. They should also ensure that their algorithms do not promote or direct users to content that constitutes denial or distortions of genocide and other atrocity crimes and glorification of perpetrators. Finally, it calls for strengthening consultations. Social media companies should be encouraged to consult with a wide variety of stakeholders, including civil society organizations and representatives of communities that have experienced atrocity crimes, to ensure that appropriate context-specific moderation efforts are being undertaken to address online hate speech, including Holocaust and genocide denial and distortion, in a timely manner. Now, all these recommendations call for, of course, increasing partnership between the United Nations and various relevant stakeholders. This is a very important element, a very important principle of the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. At the UN, we know that we cannot combat hate speech on our own, but that working together with member states, with civil society, with regional and multilateral organizations, and first and foremost with media, including new and traditional media, is paramount for a comprehensive strategy for tackling hate speech in line with the respect of international human rights standards, in particular with freedom of opinion and expression. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, and many thanks to all of the panelists for their introduction. Now, colleagues, we will start with the first segment of the list of speakers. The rule is known. 2 minutes is the speaking time limit, and the first speaker on my list is Pakistan, speaking on behalf of the OIC. Pakistan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak today on behalf of the group of OIC countries. History teaches us a simple lesson, that dehumanization knits the first knot of all genocides. Evidently, genocides have been preceded by incessant campaigns of hate speech, racial superiority, and marginalization of the target communities. These common threads have proven to be precursors of any genocidal enterprise undertaken by hostile, prejudiced actors. The advent of new technologies, in particular social media platforms, have further augmented avenues for spreading hate speech. Mr. Chair, Resolution 49/9 also stipulates the need to prevent genocide at all levels. We agree that it is the responsibility of each individual state to protect its population from genocide. However, it is most unfortunate when states themselves embark on the process of dehumanization and become purveyors of hatred, racial discrimination, and such genocidal acts. Mr. Chair, if this all seems eerily relevant, it is because these ominous indicators have been glaringly visible in the latest aggression against the besieged Palestinian people in both Gaza and the West Bank. This dehumanization campaign has been called out by CERD in its early warning. It has also called for investigation and accountability of these actions. We also echo the concerns raised by several SPMHs regarding increasing genocidal incitement over intent to, I quote, destroy the Palestinian people under occupation, unquote, and the loud calls for a second Nakba. Concerns were raised by several SPMHs regarding increased risk of genocide in occupied Palestinian territories. We agree with this observation. We believe that sufficient grounds exist to assess the nature of the crimes committed by Israel and to determine the intent to destroy Palestinian identity and existence in whole or in part. By targeted killing of over 15,000 civilians, including 70% women and children, Israel has tried to extinguish the future of a nation.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is Costa Rica, speaking on behalf of a group of countries. Costa Rica, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of members of the group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect. The use of hate speech and incitement can lay the foundations for violence against protect groups, and as such is an important early warning sign of genocide. While the propagation of hate speech has taken many forms throughout history, including anti-Semitic newspaper during the Holocaust, of the use of inflammatory radio broadcasts during the 1994 genocides against the Tutsi in Rwanda, it has become increasingly common at all major social media platforms. Because social media is privately owned and regulated, often without due respect for human rights, the task of monitoring hate speech and protecting against incitement is complicated, as it was mentioned. Social media companies and governments should work together in a manner that complies with international human rights law to prevent hate speech from being propagated on networks that operate in their country. The UN Plan of Action and Strategy on Hate Speech provides strong recommendations in this regard, as do a number of special procedures. Social media and digital platforms can also play a crucial role in the prevention of atrocity and other conflict-related crimes, as they can encourage inclusive public discourse, facilitate and inform humanitarian responses, and provide early warning of potential atrocities and violent conflict. Open source intelligence gathering holds great potential to expose atrocities. Digital communications, in particular when end-to-end encrypted, can help human rights defenders sound the alarm. We would therefore like to ask today its esteemed panelists, what are concrete and effective steps the UN member states can take to harness the potential of social media as a tool for atrocity prevention to reduce the risk of its misuse for malign purposes? Thank you very much.
For your statement. Colleagues, let me remind you about the speaking time limit of 2 minutes. And with this, let me invite the delegation of Iraq to take the floor.
شكرا السيد الرئيس يجدد العراق التزامه
Thank you, President. Iraq renews its expression of commitment to the Convention and repression of crimes of genocide. This is an odious scourge. President, systematic violations of human rights are one of the main causes of the crime of genocide, and the promotion of truth and justice and accountability are critical to prevent the commission of this crime. The social media plays a key role in the promotion of human rights, particularly freedom of expression and access to information and truth, and the condemnation of violations of human rights and the strengthening of the obligation of accountability. Disseminating information with incitement to violence or hatred exacerbates conflicts and can be an incitement to commit the crime of genocide. President, the issue of impartiality in social media has become a major change in the way in which news is spread, and this affects global opinion because the media has a key part to play in disseminating news regarding the siege on Gaza. And there has been a spike in incitement to violence. We've seen the violations committed by the occupying power, and human rights defenders have been caught up in this. Accounts have been deleted or have been distorted to convey messages of sympathy or to conceal crimes that have been committed. We need to see a collective effort to bolster international cooperation and a legal framework.
Of America, please, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, it is a tragedy that the risk of genocide and other atrocities remains ever present. We must stay committed to ending ongoing genocides and to preventing genocide and other atrocities, especially as we continue to see risks rise across the world. In the words of President Biden, preventing future genocides remains both our moral duty and a matter of national and global importance. When hatred goes unchecked and when the checks and balances in government and society that protect fundamental freedoms are lost, violence and mass atrocities can result. The Holocaust that wiped out most of my family didn't start with the gas chambers. The genocides in Rwanda and Cambodia didn't start with mass killings. They started with discrimination, with hate speech, and with referring to certain people as less human. Dehumanizing hate speech has long been a marker of genocide risk. Rohingya were compared to fleas, to thorns, to an invasive species, just as Tutsis were compared to cockroaches and Jews to rats and parasites. Today, hate speech persists and can help foment identity-based violence. Social media has an outsized influence on the rate and reach at which hate speech and online harassment spreads. We applaud efforts by some online platforms to engage on these issues. We appreciate the panel's insights on how we can work together to identify risk factors and prevent genocide and other atrocities today. With our European partners through the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, we are developing recommendations for online platforms to more effectively mitigate, prevent, and enable access to remedy for digital attacks targeting human rights defenders. Multilateral cooperation in this effort is vital, as no government mechanism, company, or organization can do it alone. So how do we prevent genocide? We start by promoting equality online and offline in our words and in our actions. I thank you.
Thank you. And next on my list is Israel.
This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a convention that was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust when 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated by the Nazis and their collaborators. 75 years on, the Jewish people are still under attack, still enduring the brutality of anti-Semitism. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israel and slaughtered Israelis for who they are. In just a few hours, 1,200 people lay dead. The Jewish people had been murdered, tortured, mutilated on a scale not witnessed since the darkest days of the Shoah. Hamas filmed their atrocities for the world to see. They used social media to spread fear and propaganda. They live-streamed their murder spree. They posted videos of their massacre, including on the personal accounts of their victims for their loved ones to see. The attacks by Hamas on October 7th were motivated by a genocidal ideology. Hamas and its supporters have encouraged the eradication of the Jewish people on social media for years. They have called for Israel's annihilation. They have spread conspiracy theories. They continue to engage in hate speech with near impunity. 75 years since the signing of the convention, anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence are on an alarming rise. According to the ADL, anti-Semitic threats surged by an alarming 488% on TikTok in the first 18 hours of October 7th. Before the bodies of the victims of October 7th were even cold, anti-Semitism exploded both offline and online. Many resorted to once again blame the Jews for their own massacre and look to protect and defend those who carried out their slaughter. Many more chose to remain silent and indifferent. Therefore, 75 years on, this generation of the Jewish people now understands how it was possible that the world stood aside during the Holocaust. The question then remains, have we learned anything in the past 75 years?
Thank you. State of Palestine, please.
Early warning to genocide must compel us to act and make sure that we prevent such atrocity. Yet for the past 8 weeks, and after issuing genocidal calls publicly and unashamedly, Israel proceeded to drop tons of explosives on Gaza, which have a huge destructive power. This unfolding man-made catastrophe for 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, half of them children, is a textbook case of genocide, in the words of numerous genocide experts. Moreover, a number of special rapporteurs said there's also a risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. They also expressed their profound concern about the failure of the international system to mobilize to prevent genocide. More horrifying, the biased approach of social media and tech companies such as Meta that has been suppressing Palestinian voices and those who support their cause through a wide campaign of digital repression, including disinformation, censorship, online harassment, and shadow banning. Social media companies so far failed to address the alarming levels of disinformation and misinformation on their platform, which are contributing to offline violence, dehumanization, and justifying attacks against civilians. A series of advertisements in the social media network have been calling for violence against Palestinians. Some contain violent content directly calling for the murder of Palestinian civilians, like ads demanding a Holocaust for the Palestinians and to wipe out Gazan women and children and the elderly. The approval of these ads is just the latest in a series of Meta's failures toward the Palestinian people. We urge tech companies and social media platforms to immediately take strict measures to protect their users from harm in light of the genocide unfolding in Palestine, and to urgently address instances of online hate speech, incitement, and violent discourse targeting Palestinians. Social media companies must ensure the respect and protection of Palestinian voices on their platforms. This commitment will reinforce their mission to provide safe digital platforms that amplify the voices of truth and could be a platform to prevent atrocities and not encourage them. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the High Commissioner for Human Rights for convening this intersessional meeting today. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, the United Kingdom remains committed to preventing atrocity crimes, upholding the responsibility to protect, and holding perpetrators accountable. As we witness atrocity crimes spreading to new parts of the world, social media has sometimes been a force for good. As the High Commissioner mentions in his latest report, the proliferation of social media content means that almost anyone, anywhere, can be a citizen journalist. By using open source intelligence techniques, organizations and individuals can corroborate and verify potential human rights violations and abuses. The United Kingdom has harnessed the potential of open source intelligence to verify and call out incidents in, for example, Sudan. However, social media too often plays a harmful role in exacerbating identity-based divisions and enabling perpetrators of atrocity crimes. It is a powerful vector for propaganda and disinformation. It can become an echo chamber for hate speech and incitement to violence, which sometimes translates into violence offline. We note efforts made by media companies to address these problems, and we call on them to strengthen this work. More must be done to remove harmful content quickly, counter misinformation, and implement mechanisms to preserve content securely for accountability purposes. In today's digital world, we must address the root causes and drivers of hate speech, as well as engaging with social media companies to do more. Panelists, how can member states leverage social media companies to harness their positive potential? Thank you.
Thank you. Qatar is the next on my list.
سيد الرئيس يضم وفد بلادي للبيان المقدم.
Thank you, President. My delegation would like to echo the various technologies that have been rolled out in the IT sphere have bolstered rights, but have also opened the door to hate speech, inciting crime and various violations that can serve as a prelude for genocide inter alia. There is a level of responsibility to be shouldered by online platforms, but we must stress the prime responsibility of states in promoting and protecting human rights and taking the necessary legislative steps to prevent hate speech and incitement. The crimes committed in places including Gaza are potential preludes to acts of genocide. We have heard statements by public personalities in Israel talking about wishing to wipe Palestinians from the face of the earth and launch a nuclear bomb in Gaza. This is clearly an incitement to genocide. It rides roughshod over international law and human values, with the legitimate right to defense being used to attempt to justify such acts. This cannot be the case. Israel does not have the right to self-defense in Gaza, given that it is an occupying force.
Thank you. Denmark, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is a very timely debate. Today, more than ever, people can express their views and enrich the public debate, which is positive. These are positive developments. But as we also know, and as we mark the 75th anniversary of the UN Genocide Convention, we need to look at the critical problem of hate speech, and also as underlined by the panelists. Public debate and civic space have been changed by digital technology to the extent where the boundaries between online and offline are increasingly blurred. Disinformation through state-owned media, censorship of private media, and growing use of AI-powered bots and trolls, content on the social media platforms significantly impact public discourse and distort mechanisms for public accountability and are used to impact elections and discredit opponents. The Internet also has given rise to the emergence of strong anti-democratic communities who are actively fragmenting and polarizing public discourse and debate. This is especially pronounced in terms of hate speech, cyberbullying, harassment, or other forms of abusive content directed towards individuals and groups online. And when online hate goes offline, it can be violent and deadly. Reflecting on their offline dimensions, these forms of contact can target individuals, but are often particularly directed towards marginalized groups or vulnerable groups, including women, LGBT+ individuals, and religious and ethnic minorities. Tech companies have a responsibility, and so do we as states. Indeed, there is a legal obligation to prevent genocide. Human rights should never be an afterthought. For Denmark, today's debate therefore reinforces our respective responsibilities, and I would like to close by asking our panelists, how can we at the Human Rights Council further contribute to preventing hate speech in the digital age while not placing undue restrictions on the freedom?
Costa Rica, please.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the convention after the horrors of the Second World War, recognizing that genocide, either committed in peace or wartime, is an international crime, we commit ourselves to both punishing it and preventing it. The day after the adoption of this convention, we adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and on the 1st of December, my country took the decision to abolish its army. It would never become, in the future, a way of overlooking the errors of the past, and we remembered, therefore, that the victims were at the very heart of our action, with an end to impunity. The world in which we are living now has seen unimaginable technological development since the emergence of the convention, and with this in mind, my delegation is hopeful of the opportunities that are available as we endeavour to eradicate human suffering. That said, technological development also poses risk. Digital platforms have brought us closer together, but they have also served to promote discrimination and hate speech, as well as dehumanization of those who are perceived as other. As such, Costa Rica calls upon those enterprises working in the digital sphere to commit to combating hate speech and disinformation campaigns which claim that certain groups have superiority over others and are intended to undermine social peace. It is up to states to shoulder the primary responsibility to ensure that technology can offer safe spaces.
Let me again remind you about the speaking time limits of 2 minutes. Ukraine, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. On this momentous occasion, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, we raise serious concerns about the use of social media platforms as potent tools to amplify hate speech, incite violence, and even genocide. Ukraine resolutely rejects the Russian propaganda in social media, which incites hatred and violence against Ukrainians, distort the reality and nature of Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. Dehumanization of the Ukrainian people and rejection of the existence of Ukraine as a state with its own national identity and culture are commonplace in modern Russia. Together with deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation, they represent a clear case for the application of the Genocide Convention. In its report, the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine expressed concerns about allegations of genocide in Ukraine, stating that some of the rhetoric transmitted in Russia state and other media may constitute incitement to genocide. It is imperative to confront the escalating use of social media platforms as conduit for hate speech and violence. By defining the problem comprehensively and developing a collective approach, we can work towards safeguarding the principles of human rights in the digital age and building a more inclusive, tolerant, and peaceful global society. Distinguished panelists, and given that such problem needs to be addressed collectively, what measures can be implemented to prevent the use of social media to spread hate speech and ensure accountability? I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. This year we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, which was the response of the international community to the horrors of the Second World War, so that such a grave crime would never again be condoned and permitted by the international community. Unfortunately, decades after adoption of the convention, the genocides in Rwanda, Srebrenica, and Cambodia reminded us that preventing genocide remains an enormous challenge. Today, as atrocities continue being committed in many parts of the world, and as pervasive racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and hate speech are amplified by the social media, the Convention remains more relevant than ever. All member states have a duty to prevent genocide, and they must not be complicit. We call on all member states to act in accordance with the letter and spirit of the Convention, as well as the well-established precedents of the UN-mandated international courts. UN also has an important role to play on prevention of genocide. The Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect should conduct its duty in an impartial manner in line with its mandate. Mr. President, the vital element distinguishing the crime of genocide from war crimes or crimes against humanity is the specific intent. We refer to the statement by CERT, which points at racist hate speech and dehumanization directed at Palestinians by senior public officials that could incite genocidal actions. We also refer to 3 statements made by a group of UN special procedures calling on the international community to prevent genocide in Gaza, latest one stating, I quote, genocide in the making, unquote, and genocidal incitement. We wish to ask the special advisor on the prevention of genocide whether she also intends to raise the alarm in line with her mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with the national human rights institutions and NGOs. And the first on my list is the Independent Commission for Human Rights.
Today, as we mark the anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, Palestinians are facing a dire situation.